Okay.
Hello and welcome to the War Report. Now we have quite the episode for you today. We're going to try actually putting graphics up on the screen, but it's very packed. We have some Israel stuff, some Syria stuff, Libya, Turkey, and some moves around Italy, and we're going to finish with U.S.-China trade. So let's jump right into it. So the Israeli elections were today. The polls were closed around 3 p.m. EST, Eastern Standard, and these were the final exit polls 2 hours before the close of the polls in Israel. So Likud had 28, Labor 25, B&W and the centrists had 31, and they were the main parties. I'll leave the graphic up there if you want to see that for yourself, but I'm not going to read all of them off. And that is from Europe Elects and Asia Elects, run by the same firm. And I'm going to pull up their most recent exit polls right now on Twitter. So I believe it was as of in as of 2 hours ago, Likud's at 42%. B&W, the centrists, are at 37. The Shas are at 9%. Labor is at again around still around 5%. So it's been a very interesting election, and let me just go get right into it. So at this point, it looks like Netanyahu's ahead. When I was making notes, actually Benny Gantz, who was the main opponent, was ahead. Now these elections saw Netanyahu and Likud on the rocks up until the past couple weeks. It looked uncertain for them, and it looked like Benny Gantz, who's the centrist newcomer, might actually take power. Now, Trump has been making recent moves to reinvigorate Netanyahu's government. So, first, of course, was the annexation of the Golan Heights, and second was him declaring the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, a terrorist group at the request of Netanyahu. So, Netanyahu is concerned, and it was reported that Likud party internal polls weren't looking good before the election. It was actually hilarious because there were footage of Netanyahu out on a beach, either I can't remember if it was yesterday or today, pretty much just begging people to vote and handing out party pamphlets. Did you see that?
I didn't catch that. I didn't
Uh,
catch it.
it was yeah, he was harassing people at the beach saying, "Vote for me, I need it."
It's pretty desperate. Like you, I thought Gantz was going to win, mind you. Like with Israeli politics, in 2009, Netanyahu and Likud had a slightly even worse outcome than what we saw this afternoon. And through the particulars of the Knesset, we're still able to wield power because I don't quite understand how it works. I know that Gantz has reached out to the other smaller party members to try to form a coalition, or other members of the coalition had asked Gantz, but he refused. These would have been the Arab parties and possibly the Orthodox Party. So,
Yeah, he went for the Labor
um,
Party too, like the more left-wing liberal
yeah,
side.
but yes. So it looks like that Netanyahu has won, basically.
Yes, and it's interesting because he also pulled out a last-minute promise last night, saying he would officially annex the Israeli settlements in the West Bank.
Oh, wow.
Now, I am torn on Netanyahu's, I guess we could say at this point, presumptive victory. Because on one hand, he risks drawing the U.S. into a war. He has Trump by around his finger, and he's getting a lot of what he wants in terms of Netanyahu and Likud's goals. But on the other hand, Netanyahu also isolates the majority liberal democratic diaspora community in the U.S. and makes them feel more isolated from Israel, which somewhat breaks, I guess you could say, their hold over us. Because I mean, you see this all the time. Israel always appeals to the diaspora, and again, a lot of the diaspora do not like Netanyahu. They do not like the conservatives in the Likud party, and would prefer someone like a Benny Gantz.
Yeah, I mean, I see the logic to that. It's a sound logic, but I think if there was no war in Syria, I think that would apply. However, I don't think Israel really cares whether left-wing diaspora Jews support him right now or not. I mean, if he cares to some degree, but um, I don't think it's crucial. I think for him, I think American power is more crucial than anything else.
Yeah, the influence over the
Um,
current administration via Jared Kushner and
yeah,
John Bolton is
yeah,
much more important than whatever some Jewish guy who lives in New York thinks. He might have a bit more money, he might donate one way or another politically, but again, at the end of the day, you want the Jared Kushner and the John Bolton, the Mike Pompeo, and the people directly influencing Trump over him.
Right, right. And let's face it, the Democrats might be, what, 5% less cooperative with Israel compared to the Republicans. It's often this is very situational. It's based on priorities. But I, for instance, don't buy this notion that Obama was bad for Israel. I mean, first of all, I don't care if he was bad for Israel, but um, I simply don't buy it. There's the time and the circumstance, and was only so much that Obama could do. And yes, they differed with Israel on Iran. I suppose that was significant, but it's not like apart from that, nothing really dramatic changed.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that you bring that up because I was going to get into the Beto O'Rourke thing, his comments on Netanyahu,
Right.
and it's interesting because
I like your tweet, by the way.
Yeah, I saw a cartoon going around in 2013 when, like, the 2014 it was when the Israel-Gaza conflict really picked up then, and pretty much it was a cartoon Obama writing a letter saying, "Dear Benjamin, please stop bombing Gaza, your friend Barack," and he pretty much throws the letter on top of a pile of missiles.
Yeah, yeah, they're not intimidated. I mean,
Yeah, but
come on.
When in terms of the Beto thing, Beto O'Rourke, the failed Senate candidate against Ted Cruz, who's now running for president on the Democratic side, he pretty much came out last night and said, "Oh, I think Netanyahu's a racist for his policy towards the Palestinians," and I hammer this over and over and over again. You'll get these neoliberals like O'Rourke who will say, "Oh, Israel needs to stop bombing Gaza. They need to stop building settlements in the West Bank." But again, at the end of the day, these are the same neoliberals that will give them the missiles that they lob at Damascus airport.
Right, right. And can you be racist if you're also Semitic to the same degree? Because of course, the racism card is most effective against Europeans and whites and so on. So,
oh, absolutely. But yeah, I just thought that was a funny aside in the lead up to the
mhm.
Israeli elections. The fact that look, they'll whine and complain about Gaza all day, but they're fully in support when those missiles are hitting Damascus and Latakia. But whatever.
Or when they criticize Saudi Arabia, and
Oh,
they're still
absolutely.
funding them with
Yeah.
the war in Yemen. So it's just optics.
Oh, of course. It's all politics, and we shouldn't be surprised by this. But speaking of Syria, action near Idlib has actually simmered down to agree with the occasional skirmishes and airstrikes. I suppose I could pull that up right now. So here's your map on Syria in general. Of course, I'll pull up the key for those of you who want to see what parts of it. All these dots represent actions by the various different sides. And that blue dot right there is where the primary U.S. forces are. That's like where their main thing is, like Golan Heights down here. But I think you all get the idea. So
Hmm.
uh, action near Idlib has really boiled down to the occasional skirmish, and more news out of Syria was Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has rejected U.S. preconditions for rebuilding Syria. Now, Moscow's plan, what they have in mind, is they want to see Assad's government remain. They're working towards the removal of landmines in cooperation with the UN, and they want to see the resettlement of refugees back into Syria. That's one of the big points, and that's gonna strike fear into the hearts of the European liberals. I know that for sure.
Putin is literally de-diversifying Europe as we speak.
Yeah, yeah. The shame is, 70% of them weren't actually Syrians. So, again,
Yeah, well,
you
yeah,
can keep most of your diverse. So you just want 30% of it.
yeah.
Maybe Putin does have a lot of Jewish advisors, but that's aside the point, of course. So it is also believed that Assad will be taking an official visit to Iraq either this month or the next month. Now, this would be a landmark visit if it did happen, seeing as Iraqi and Syrian relations have never really been that good. Of course, under Saddam, Assad's father and Saddam did not like each other. They had a very adversarial relationship. After the Iraq War, after Saddam was overthrown, the Washington installed government, of course, would not let the new Iraqi government work with Syria. Now, Assad's travels aren't officially announced for obvious reasons, for security reasons, and we don't know for sure if it's going to happen. But if it does occur, it would follow.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay. Uh, I'll just turn on the screen sharing. Wonderful technical difficulties even off air. I know this is what the people tune in for. But as I was saying, if Assad does visit Iraq, it would follow the visit to Damascus by Iraqi Armed Forces Chief of Staff Othman al-Gahami.
Yeah, this is a major development because they are also meeting to discuss air defense.
Yeah, I was actually just about to go into
Uh,
that one.
yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Uh, so security forces and security preparation for the potential trip are being overseen by the IRGC and specifically Soleimani and his forces. And the U.S. has also declared the IRGC a terrorist group, with Iran responding and declaring the U.S. Central Command a terrorist group at the same time. Now, this was likely a pre-election stunt by Bibi, for Bibi by Trump, much like the Golan Heights moves. Now, the issue with the U.S. doing these sort of things is we are making moves that are not easily reversible in order to solve a temporary problem just to get Netanyahu a few more years in office. So, again, of course, these things happen. We can go on about them all day. But as you were saying, on top of all this, Iran and Iraq have reached a deal to cooperate on air defenses. It is said that they will be focusing on aerial threats that may come from the western airspace, which you would think, of course, Israel, possibly, maybe not so much at this point, Incirlik, Suda Bay in Greece, that's one of the U.S. airfields in Greece, or maybe the British airfields in Cyprus. You would think that area, but yeah, Iran and Iraq are actually moving to have official cooperation on air defenses.
I think it's a remarkable development, um, and it's allowing, of course, Iran to project its power uh, far more westward than in centuries.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Really, when you think about it.
the most they've had over the past 40 years since the rise of the Islamic Republic has been, oh, Hezbollah launched a few missiles, or oh, Assad is an ally of Iran, but and there's some forces there because of the war, but it hasn't been that much. But actually expanding their air defense apparatus into Iraq is a major move. And Washington is not going to be happy about this. Now, what they're going to do about it, I don't know. It's a very precarious situation because at this point, okay, number one, they're not in the position to go to war with Iran right now with just the geopolitical situation and the election in about a year and a half. Trump is going to be up for re-election soon, so they don't want to start a major war that especially with Iran, that could be that disastrous and risk losing their guy in power for it. And number two, you start a war with Iran, that's a war with Syria, that's another war with Iraq, and that's a war with pretty much every all. I mean, how many Shia Muslims do you think we radicalized by a war with Iran?
Probably a lot, but they're still not strapping on vests, and they're still not committing terrorist attacks like Salafists.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. They're much more effective because they actually go to fight in the battlefield.
Right, exactly, and that's going to continue. Um, it's hard to say what America is going to do. America, I think, is absolutely committed to Syria. I think they're committed to not probably as long and remain in Syria probably as long as they did in Iraq, maybe longer.
Oh yeah,
Because
definitely. And like I said, if there is by some miracle withdrawal, the country's still going to be crawling with U.S. contractors.
right, right. So I don't see them leaving anytime soon. Um, the complexity of the situation will remain there vis-a-vis the Kurds, for instance, and Iran's presence, because Iran's presence in Syria is, even if, and they are moving away from southern Aleppo, by the way, despite the Israeli strikes. However, we'll get into it later, but their commercial presence, their economic presence is going to remain in Syria.
Oh yeah, and the main reconstruction effort is being spearheaded by, of course, Russia. But then you see Iran and China are also the other big two that are reinvesting in Syria after the war. And I did want to mention one last thing about the IRGC and potential for war with Iran. Now, I think Trump's declaration, of course, Trump at this point is pretty much just a puppet of whoever is nicest to him that day. That's pretty much what he's devolved into, whether it be John Bolton, Jared Kushner, Mike Pompeo, any of these figures. But I don't think it's necessarily so Trump can launch a war in Iran. If he loses in 2020 and they get another candidate, the stage is set. The IRGC is a terrorist group. They have the prerequisites to launch that war, or even that if they have to wait until 2024 to do that. The point is they're setting the stage now because of the current situation and the little bit of old Trump that's still left in him. they're probably not going to get a war with Iran anytime soon.
Right. I don't. I simply don't see the pretense for it. I mean, yes, they would like to have a war with Iran, or they would like someone else to have a war with Iran, perhaps. But the American base isn't there. The voting Trump's voting base isn't there. I think that left wing Democrats, of course, I suppose in honor of Obama's legacy, will not be in favor of a war because, as far as they're concerned, Blum ruined a perfectly good agreement with Iran, and they're not going to support him. I mean, they're not going to support him on anything. Venezuela is maybe a small exception, and it's also just basically optics cooking on their part to seem patriotic, and also because it's on the hemisphere, it's much more untenable to oppose Trump in Venezuela.
Yeah, and
Also,
it's a lot more low risk too, despite the Russian presence. It seems like if a war did break out, it'd be a lot cleaner than a war with Iran would be.
right. So, as we've mentioned, that yes, Bibi Netanyahu, of course, would like to have liberal Jews in the West and in America support him, but they're not. But I see very little support for a war in Iran, and America fighting Iran is not going to be like Iraq or Libya. I think it's going to be a very, very different animal.
Oh no, I mean you have what 7 years, 8 years worth of battle-hardened IRGC troops from Syria that they can move right back to Iran at the snap of a finger. They have been preparing for an invasion for what 40 years since the revolution back in '79. They are in a much better state than what Saddam was. They aren't coming off the end of a disastrous war like Saddam was. Their system isn't as nepotistic as someone like Saddam. Their system is actually more merits based. I know, of course, there's corruption, but their military is a lot better structured. That's why they beat Saddam even back in the '80s with when Saddam had the backing of both the U.S. and Soviet Union. They still won against that. That's why they've had so much success in Syria. I mean, one could argue Soleimani is the reason Assad is still in Damascus today. And
Hmm.
yeah,
Good point.
they're not. They're going up against a battle-hardened force in their homeland, and that spells disaster. And again, if that were to happen, we would have to go full John Bolton and lob a nuke at them.
Yeah, and I don't see that happening either. And of course, Israel isn't going to do anything either. So Israel doesn't have the reach, and Israel is going to have to just remain preoccupied with Syria. So
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Israel's future is fighting off Hezbollah, Hamas, and whatever forces are in Syria that launch strikes at them or that defend themselves from Israeli strikes, and maybe some trouble from the West Bank every once in a while. But yeah, Israel, I don't think they're going to be destroyed or collapsed anytime soon. But they're going to have a lot of fights on the home front that they have to deal with before they can even worry about Iran itself.
yeah,
So, on a much more, I guess you could say, optimistic note, let's talk about Libya because there's been some interesting developments there. So, of course, the background: Gaddafi dies, Gaddafi gets overthrown and killed. The country plunges in the civil war, gets plunged in the civil war after they form somewhat of a new government. A former anti-Gaddafi general backed by the CIA, but kind of spurned by them, decided to take power. He's head of the LNA, which I'll get into, but General Khalifa Haftar, who's head of the Libyan National Army here in red, is making the final push towards Tripoli, which is of course controlled in the blue by the Tripoli-backed government, which is the Government of National Accord, which is the one recognized by the UN. So, as I was saying, Haftar is a former anti-Gaddafi and U.S.-backed general who's been sweeping across Libya ever since the outbreak of the Second Civil War in 2014, and now at this point controls most of the country. Now, Haftar has a very weird coalition supporting him. He has supported the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Russia, with the U.S. not taking an outright official stance but has issued threats against him. Now, the head of the EU Parliament criticized France for their support of Haftar and the LNA. So that's a very odd coalition. You have these Gulf states, you have Egypt, Russia, and France all supporting one side. And the GNA, the UN-backed government, is recognized by Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UN, and to an extent the U.S. but it does not field its own army and remains on militias loyal to the state. So it's a bit odd because the GNA, they are the more Islamist side, despite not having the back in Saudi Arabia. It's all very odd. It's all very convoluted. It makes Syria look like a very straightforward situation. The war in Libya does, but it's crazy because Haftar. I think, of course, he's probably the better option here, and the fact that the UN doesn't back him does somewhat bolster my view on that. But
Yeah. Well, I mean, Libya is also a Muslim Brotherhood stronghold. And of course, Turkey supports Libya for that reason. And I see, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and Russia. And Russia is United Arab Emirates, of course, is funding Egypt, as is Russia, right? So I think they're looking at this as an opportunity to get rid of the Muslim Brotherhood in North Africa.
yeah,
And it's
it's
interesting
interesting
that it,
because I was about to get into that because you actually see in Benghazi a lot of the Muslim Brotherhood radicals are being replaced by Wahhabist radicals because of the Saudi influence.
right, right. I mean, this is it's messed up, and it's going to keep Libya a dysfunctional country for decades. But um, if the regime is toppled, and it looks like it probably will be, Turkey's influence in North Africa will be very little after this. And so, the armed branch and even the political branch of the Muslim Brotherhood is going to be reduced as a result. But yeah, it's more complicated than that. As you say, there are like literally Wahhabists that are filling in some of those positions. But the timing is interesting with what's happening in Algeria. And I forget, how do you pronounce the old president of Algeria? I can never pronounce his name properly. But
Yeah, I
so
always
he is
botch it too. It's one of those kind of names.
so he has stepped down. He has stepped down, and and Algeria has. It's not an outright ally of Russia, but they have a pretty sophisticated military. They have all the latest MiGs and Sukhois. So they're an important partner with Russia in that regard. Um, Now, I doubt that Algeria is going to go up in flames. I'm pretty certain of that. I might be wrong, but I don't think that the Muslim Brotherhood is going to get in there. And even if it does, I think it'll be short lived in the way that it was short lived in Egypt.
Yeah, you'll probably get some strongman who comes in, shuts down their reign. And speaking of strongmen, it seems like Haftar, a former general, and despite him turning against Gaddafi, was someone who served under Gaddafi, may seem like he may be the strongman that Libya needs to, clean up there. But don't get too excited about him because he is 75 years old and has had to actually take an emergency visit to France last year for medical reasons. And as I was saying, another issue is the rise of Wahhabist preachers in Benghazi as opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood one. So you're pretty much trading one evil for another, and again, it doesn't look that great. But one good piece of news out of this is the U.S. had the foresight to evacuate troops and diplomatic personnel from Tripoli this time. So, we're going to avoid another Benghazi at least.
Right, and that's interesting with the way Turkish and American relations have been this week as well, and last week. In that sense, America by America not supporting the Libyan regime, they're also rejecting Turkey. Consider this with Turkey, for instance, threatening that you can't kick us out of NATO, we're going to leave NATO, and Turkey's sticking to the S-400 system, and they're not going to buy the F-35s and so on. So, it's a wise move, but it's also a move that's going to leave a bitter taste in Turkey's mouth as well.
Yeah, like even a year ago, if this situation were happening and Haftar was right outside of Tripoli's gates, the U.S. probably would have still stayed there in attempts to try to stay friendly with Turkey. But I think both the U.S. and the Turkish governments have realized time for cooperation with each other has passed. They no longer serve each other's interests. There's too much animosity, especially at this point, for them to continue cooperating. And it's interesting that you bring that up because I was actually just about to segue into the S400 deal. So let me change
Yeah.
my graphics here. I like to brag about this because it's something new, and I'm kind of proud of myself for this one. So we got yourself a nice giant
Good
S400
stuff.
here on the screen. It's uh,
Woo!
yeah. Um, so
Give it
Turkey.
up for the
Oh
S400.
yeah, yes, absolutely. I stand the S400 or whatever. But Turkey has rejected the ultimatum issued by the U.S. in regards to its purchase of the S400 missile systems. Now, Turkish FM Foreign Minister Kavu Solglu has said that the quote S400 is a done deal and will not step back. And this comes after Mike Pence saying you'll be expelled from the F-35 program. Oh, what a scary threat! I might not get an F-35. How will I ever live? Exactly. I'll live because I won't get the F-35. That's why.
Just a quick aside. I mean, there was that Japanese F-35 that disappeared for an hour and a half.
I did
Did
not
you?
hear about that one. I did not hear about the one.
Yeah,
Do
so
tell
they
though.
this for a while Japan thought like one of its pilots had died in the Pacific somewhere. So as far as I know, it showed up again, but that's forced them now to ground the 12 remaining F-35s.
Well,
So
you'll
again,
remember.
very similar to what happened with Israel last
Yeah,
year.
you'll remember back in like October, November, we were talking about how pretty much every country but the British grounded the F-35.
Mhm. Like they already have the F-16. It's a phenomenal, and the F-15. I mean, they're phenomenal planes. They're still relevant. I
Yeah,
mean,
and for
the
stealth purposes,
F-15
the
is arguably the
F-22
best
is
dogfighter.
yeah, like
Go ahead.
and for stealth purposes, the F-22 isn't that bad. Again, they're
No.
trying to make something that is ultimately unneeded and that has completely failed.
Yeah. Yeah, and also technology is changing. Like Russia, basically, one of the reasons why they're keeping so many of their older planes is because their missile technology is so advanced that now they can like they don't even have to get as close. So for tactical strikes and interception, they don't have to involve themselves in a dogfight. I mean, the dogfights are always going to be relevant, but they're not as relevant as World War One. Okay, like I mean, there is a trend that's been developing over the last 100 years, and so as missile technology and stealth become more important, I mean, and it's too bad that the F-35's technical problems persist because I mean, it's an okay plane, but the 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 exhaust in the back is circular, and that gives it away. So it's not really the greatest spy plane ever.
Oh, absolutely not. It's like very very subtle F-35, very subtle. But yeah, as you were saying, the Russians and the Chinese and pretty much every power but the U.S. and Western Europe have focused on missile technology. Even Japan is focused on missile technology over aircraft because it's the future. And I was even seeing things as far back as 2015 saying, are aircraft carriers outdated? Are they the white elephant of the U.S. Navy? And I'm starting to agree with that sentiment. I thought that was ridiculous when I first saw it back then, but the more and more time goes on, the more and more missile technology develops. I think maybe they're not completely irrelevant, but maybe we're putting too much stock in them.
I would think so. I mean, think of the amount of American warships, not of course not piloted by Americans, but the ones that were given to Yemen that have been sunk by missiles, literally from dinghies. And in the Red Sea area. Uh, yeah, I think that these are numbered, or the same reason why China has the largest submarine fleet in the world.
I thought it was North Korea, but it doesn't surprise me that's China. But I know North Korea is also pretty big. But yeah, I get what you're saying. But on top of all this, you had Mike Pence threatening over the F-35. But Turkey has also warned, as a response to that threat, warned the U.S. against forming an official alliance with the Kurds in Syria, which, look, isn't going to happen. The U.S. will operate in Kurdish territory. We will use them as much as they use us, but no formal alliance will be formed because we will still hold on to the notion, which is, somewhat likely depending on how leadership changes in Turkey, that Turkey may decide to come back towards the U.S. a few years down the road. I mean, look, Erdogan, he's become more pro-Russia now, but he's not going to be in power forever. No leader is. He could be, there could be a successful coup. He could lose the next election. He could just decide to step down. His successor decides, oh, we're going to be more pro-U.S. again. But Turkey's going to be constantly pivoting back and forth. So the U.S. isn't going to burn too many bridges. They'll burn some bridges like they did in Libya, but they're not going to burn them all.
Right. That's an excellent point. Yeah, they're going to wait it out. America cannot afford to have Turkey leave NATO. The kind of power projection that would give Russia would be tremendous.
Yeah. I mean, I can just hear all the neoliberals shrieking at the thought of Turkey leaving NATO, and it's kind of humorous. But speaking of NATO, we had a bit of an interesting thing because NATO is now 70 years old, and let's get some nice little maps up here. So, in its inception, 1949, these were the original members of NATO right here in the blue. 2019, where we stand, they're in the yellow right here. So just keep that in mind. So, getting into that, April 4th marked the 70th anniversary of the Washington Treaty, the foundational document of NATO, and 70 years after its inception and 28 years after the fall of the USSR, NATO now cites China, not Russia, as the major threat. Now, I do find this comical for a couple reasons. So, China, while they may present an economic threat to the Europeans, do not present a military threat to them at all. The only countries that are threatened by China's militaries are the countries directly neighboring them and the countries within the range of their missile program if World War III were to break out, which isn't likely despite my geopolitical simulator gameplay last night. I was going over that a little bit. The world went to hell, and I feel like I take a little bit of responsibility for that, but that's aside the point. So the second and funnier reason that about the whole China's the main threat thing is you can tell that the NATO leadership is now trying to deliberately take heat off of Russia. Because ever since the 2008 war with Georgia, NATO has pretty much been extorting money from the US by crying about Russian aggression and how the Soviet Union will reform and conquer all of Europe. And now you'll see that European states are willing to trade with Russia. You see this happening in Germany, Italy, even as far east as Poland, and even some of the Baltics to an extent. They have to shift. They can't cry about Russian aggression anymore. And especially when they're trading in the energy sector, this argument becomes very invalid.
Right. Reality has set in. I mean, I think America will continue to, have a new list of sanctions, and of course, Britain will be right behind them, and so on. Britain always fearful about, who is the big power bloc or the big power in Europe proper. Yeah, it's kind of hilarious to me that the implication is if China is the greatest military threat, the only way we can get close to China is to conquer Russia first. So, and that's why we were building more and more bases. But yes, I wonder about if there's going to be a provocation over the Sea of Azov or not. I wonder if that's going to happen. That's a pretty big that's a pretty big stick to carry and not walk softly. So I look forward to see what happens there.
Now, just further on going on NATO, with the rise of Trump, NATO has seen a sharp decrease in popularity in both the U.S. and Europe, in which I have a nice little poll right here to show. Now, let's pull that up right here. So this is NATO support from 2017 to 2019. Now, for strongly support in the UK, 42 strongly support in 2017. Strongly support now in 2019, only 25%. Germany is 41 and 22. France is 21 and 9%. Denmark is 44 and 32%. Norway is 54 and 34%. And the U.S. jumped from 25 to 27%. But support overall and skepticism has grown. I will leave the chart here. I won't read over all the points because there's 6 or 7 different categories. But I will leave it up on the screen for those of you who want to see it. And for those of you who want to zoom in on it and stuff, I posted on my Twitter very recently, so you can check that out. But I just thought it was interesting. Of course, in the U.S., because Trump dared to question it, the liberals and the neocons instantly bolstered support for it. But you're seeing in Europe, and even a lot of these Western European countries, a lot of countries even like Britain and France and Germany, that support is dropping.
Right, and even in countries that you mentioned, Norway, that supported quite a bit, it also is dropping. They're all like well under half. As long, I mean, Russia isn't. It's becoming obvious that Russia isn't going to invade Europe. Well, it's obvious that Russia is interested in an economic cooperation with Europe, and especially with its gas. That they're not in the mood for getting into a war. I mean, that's just a. I mean, we all know that that's simply a ploy to continue spending for NATO. So
Yeah,
you
I
can
mean, Russian
fund
military.
great
Go on.
so you can fund great projects like the F-35.
Oh, absolutely. But yeah, Russian military doctrine has been built around defense ever since the Cold War. I mean, the Russians are autistic about, air defenses and anti-missile systems, and that's not the sign of a country that wants to invade the entire world.
Right. Their philosophy is very similar to Iran's. They expect war will eventually come from the West, and this goes all the way back to the at the end of the Second World War. You had former Tsarist generals who warned that after World War One that there would be another push from the West to get into Russia. So they've always suspected it, and of course they've experienced it. So yeah, that doctrine is going to continue.
Now, just a few more thoughts on NATO in general. So, throughout the Cold War, NATO was seen as the strong front to deter a Soviet communist invasion. Now, after the collapse of communism, NATO continued to spread eastward despite several sayings that they wouldn't, despite promises to Gorbachev that, oh, we'll just stay, in Germany, we won't go any further. And after they turned into the anti-communist defense force of the 1940s to the 1980s, they became the quote-unquote humanitarian interventionists of the 1990s. You would think somewhere like Yugoslavia, what happened there is the humanitarian bomber sort of thing. And then in the 2000s, they pivoted to becoming the counterterrorism force of the world. And then in the 2010s, they decided they needed to be the force to counter a resurgent Russia. Now that that argument doesn't work, they're preparing for the 2020s by feigning a fear of China and saying we're going to be the anti-China task force.
Right, and government instituted homosexuality. That's the other reason for
Oh,
NATO.
absolutely. We've all seen the rainbow NATO flag. We've all seen it.
I know it's just, yeah, yeah. So this is ridiculous. The argument that NATO is, I mean, there always is going to be an argument as long as there's a strong, robust America and American interest in Europe. There's probably going to be some remnant of NATO, even if it's just a couple of countries.
Yeah, it's going to be the U.S., UK, and like Denmark. That's going to be like all NATO is in like 2050.
Right. Because Russia is going to fly around over the Arctic Circle and attack Britain and Norway and so on. I mean, but I think NATO is basically going to play the Baltic states. They're going to continue using Poland and the Baltic states to play against Russia, to hamper, trade probably going in through St. Petersburg and the Baltic Sea and so on. That's already increasing. That's already in play. And Russia's countering that with bringing Belarus into Russia proper. But yeah, it doesn't wash. I thought it was interesting that Tulsi Gabbard refused to stand up and clap at when the Stoltenberg was in Washington.
Well, I did not hear about that, but that's honestly amazing. Now, as for NATO's reasons for existing, as they've become more contrived, and again, your average European isn't afraid of China, considering the fact they're on the other side of the world. It's become less popular amongst the European left and right alike. Especially with the rise of populism in Europe, many southern and eastern Europeans have began to blame NATO for the migrant crisis because of their wars in Iraq, Libya, and Syria.
Yeah, they've had to pay the price for it. I mean, they've become holding centers. Even Macedonia now has, in order to enter the EU and NATO, has had to sign a pact to basically house and take care of tens of thousands of migrants. right? I mean, and it's just all it is to lay off pressure on Germany and France and Denmark and other and Sweden to some extent. That's really what what this is about. That's you have to pay to like twice to be in the club.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But the way I see it, NATO is it's becoming increasingly irrelevant, and again, especially amongst the European people, they're not seeing a reason for it. And honestly, I think the only way to destroy NATO is for a major war to break out to trigger Article 5 and watch most, if not all, countries not honor it.
Hmm. Interesting. Um, and that's an interesting proposal, but I can't imagine. I can't imagine the war it would take for that for Article 5 to be invoked. Only because if it's a small scale war, let's say it's no bigger than Yugoslavia, which as horrible as it was not a war even of the magnitude that Syria is. Uh, I think then you would have NATO states actually go along with it. Uh, but it would take a fairly large war, I think, for them to invoke Article 5 and leave NATO. I think I think basically cooperation, the kind, and I know we're going to get into it, but cooperation that we're seeing between Italy and Russia, and Italy, Russia, and China, uh, I think that long term kind of erodes the purpose of NATO and its reputation.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think NATO won't be dissolved. I don't even think like a lot of major countries will leave it, but I think it will become an alliance in name only, where they're all part of this organization, but it just means nothing besides the fact that the leaders meet once a year.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Like
So
in our lifetime, I can't see it in our lifetime. It just disappearing.
maybe yours, Boomer, but not to cross into that territory, but
Oh, oof. Yeah. Yeah, where do I get off? Um, yeah, but yeah, that's all I'll say about it.
but I did want to get a little bit into Brexit because apparently that's still a thing. And again, from what I've seen, they want another extension. People are saying only 72 hours until we get out of the EU. That's what a lot of the coat posters in the UK have been saying, like, oh, we're finally getting out and we're going to make Britain great again. Kind of like the whole like MAGA thing over here. They're just stuck and convinced it's still 2016 and they're still going to get their way. But you were telling me a little bit about it, so if you want to take the floor on this one.
Well, I mean, as far as I know, so the extensions, there's a debate. It's not a very serious debate about the extension. Donald Tusk is suggesting, a flexible one. It could go well into 2020. Merkel is suggesting that end of 2019 is possible. What they're basically afraid of is having short deadlines where nothing has been resolved, and then the can has to be kicked down a few months. I mean, I personally think this is I don't want to be conspiratorial, but I think this kicking the can further down the road uh, is a way for Brexit to never happen.
I don't think that's conspiratorial at
Is
all.
I think they just want people so sick of Brexit they ask for a second vote and it's nay.
Yeah, similar to
I
what they
actually think
did to
that's the
the.
strategy.
Yeah, that's what they did to the Irish entry referendum. They just kept on pushing it until they voted yes.
Right.
But ultimately, there's not much to say about Brexit except that it's never going to happen. That the European Union will crumble into a million pieces before the UK even makes a solid deal to get out. But I just figured it was worth mentioning, just even for the couple minutes we did here. But I do want to move into something a bit more interesting. So we had the Estonia elections a few weeks back, and those were the results from it. The Reform in the yellow is the left-wing party, the Center, of course, in the green there, and the Conservative in the blue. So I'll get into the Estonian elections. So they happened actually in the last couple weeks in March, which saw victories for the right wing and the populist. Now these parties are just now making inroads to form a new government, the current centrist Prime Minister Yuri Ratas has come to an agreement with the Conservative Fatherland Party and the far-right EKRE, and they have a coalition that would control 56 of 101 seats of the parliament. However, the situation is still uncertain because the leader of the left-wing Reform Party, Kaya Kallas, is attempting to win over individual members of the centrist and conservative parties who aren't comfortable with allying with the far right. So as of Saturday, Kallas has 2 weeks to form a cabinet, and if she can't, the president, Kersti Kalyudad, is likely to hand over power to the right-wing coalition.
I have to be honest. I haven't kept on top of Estonian politics. I don't know quite what's going on there. I mean, I know generally what I think from an American or NATO perspective is wanted, and that is to have like a majority, an upper crust that is liberal and aligned with, to have a significant right-wing I hate Russia minority, but sizable, like over 15%, like in excess of 20. And then, you do this balancing act where you have populist right-wing movements that are definitively against Russia, but not so much that they're against the EU and NATO and, Global Homo and so on. So I don't know if this election changes that dynamic dramatically or not.
Well, it creates actually an interesting dynamic because you would think, you see for the people watching on the stream, that little green area where the Centrist Party won, that's actually the most ethnically Russian district in Estonia, and they voted for the centrist, the current power structure. The interesting thing about Estonia is, of course, they're NATO and the EU wants to play the whole anti-Russia, we have to stand up against Russia thing, whether that be through right-wing nationalists or through left-wing liberals. But it's interesting because the right-wing nationalists, they haven't said much about Russia. They haven't said, really have a state policy towards Russia. Their big concern is keep the migrants out of Estonia. We don't care about anything else. Just keep the migrants out of Estonia. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of them said, "Oh yeah, Russia looks like more of an attractive option for that reason." But either way,
well, I remember statistics from 2014 where Russians were voting more right wing in Estonia than Estonians on a per capita basis over this issue, right? So that whole sort of Slavic xenophobia that you're not coming into my country has primarily worked very well for Estonia, and I don't think that a lot of ethnic Russians in Estonia think that Russia and Estonia are going to go to war. So it's an important card to play.
Yeah, I mean, Russians are the only diaspora group that will vote more right wing than the native population. Thank you, Russia. Very cool.
I mean, it's so fucking based.
Absolutely. Not only based, it's also based and red-pilled. Thank you very much.
That's right.
But I just thought it was interesting because, again, aside from just the foreign policy implications in terms of Russia, just the growth of populism throughout Europe, it's affecting countries as far as, France to Estonia. The fact that pretty much no country has been spared except arguably the UK from this. And, one of the countries that need it most, they decide, nope. You're not getting the visit from the populist tooth fairy, or whatever analogy you want to make this. I don't care. Just pick your favorite one.
Yeah.
But I just thought it was interesting to see that fact that even the ethnic Russians are going to vote for the more right wing parties, and it's hilarious. And I do want to move on to probably one of the biggest stories of the week that really hasn't been getting covered. So I'll give you a nice little visual. Look, secure the bag. That is pleb tier. We got to secure the bar, okay?
Secure the bar. Stop whining.
Black pilled and $1,000 a month. No. You're going to be white pilled, get a bar of gold and a free plot of land, plus a wife and 3 kids. That's what Salvini will give you. Andrew Yang, pleb tier. I'm sorry. But in all seriousness, let's get right into this. The current Italian government has decided to challenge the banks head-on with 2 bills this week. And we were actually discussing this actually a few months ago, that Salvini was really, not only Salvini, but the entire Italian government was really going up against the banking system. So 2 bills have been proposed by Lega and the Five Star Movement. Now, the first would require the Italian central bank to sell the shares they hold in the Italian treasury at rates they would have sold them at in the 1930s. The second and more significant one would declare Italian nationals are the owners of the Bank of Italy's 102 billion USD worth of gold reserves. Even members of the opposition party have come out to support this move. That's how popular it is. Now, the government has blamed the central bank for the last crisis, and Salvini said, quote, if you are here with your current accounts in the red, it is because the people who were supposed to control things did not do so. The new law, would also regarding gold, has 60% support amongst the legislature.
Yeah, it's huge. There's huge support for it. This popular support, and Salvini is actually threatening, nationwide protests in support of it if it doesn't go through. Of course, the Italy Central Bank is tied up with the EU, and their spokesmen have said that this is impossible. These are these are bank assets, and it simply can't be. But this is going to be a very interesting standoff.
Oh, absolutely, and it is. We were talking how Salvini pretty much a few months ago was painting a target on his chest, yet they can't hit the guy. I mean, he's up there to become the legendary status where maybe I'm over exaggerating a bit, but I'm seeing him become someone like Putin or Assad, who they push to get out of power for 20 years, but still don't succeed to do it. And again, not even Putin or Assad have made a move this bold.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. I mean, Putin has, but it goes on quietly because it's so blackpilling for the establishment with regards to their bank. But this hits home because Italy is both NATO, it's part of the EU, it's part of the Western Bloc. So I see. I mean, it's a tremendous challenge. I would say that this challenge is in many ways as severe or more than Brexit was.
Oh yeah, I mean, they can stay in the European Union. They can stay in NATO. They can stay part of all these structures. But they do this. Again, as you were saying, it is more of a blow than the British simply leaving the European Union and staying part of the neoliberal world order and the global financial system. Italy, in essence, is threatening to leave the global financial system. And I didn't cover this story last week because I didn't have too much information on it. And I imagine more information will come out in the coming weeks. But Russia and China are actually moving to form their own financial system in an attempt to circumvent U.S. sanctions. Now, they've been moving towards this for years, mainly on the issue of Iran, but pretty much they're creating, again, their own independent financial system from what the U.S. and the Western world has. And Italy is pretty much, they haven't joined that bloc yet, but they're pretty much making an equivalent move.
Right. This is the SWIFT alternative. So Switzerland, of course, is also having very good relations with China over this move. It could be that just I think the economic tide of where things are going is probably going to affect more positive change than even the protests are. But you need a leader like Salvini to accomplish this, to have the political will, because the truth is, what is America going to do? Is it going to bomb Italy? Is it going to go to war over Italy? Is France going to join in? Is Germany going to join in? What would be the cost of doing?
You can justify this against a country like Syria or even Iran, or to an extent, maybe not direct military action, but a lot of crippling economic action. You can justify it against Russia and China, but you're not going to be able to justify this against a Western first world country like Italy.
Yeah, exactly. It will. I mean, it'll really alienate, amongst other things, Italian Americans.
Oh yeah, I was just about to say that. I was about to say you might be invoking my dual loyalty. I might do one of the things I criticize people for most.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, the Italians are very much beloved by lots of other nationalities. So. Yeah, it's the timing is impeccable, because as that SWIFT system is forming and it's getting the legitimacy from Switzerland, no less, Salvini is making this important move. So it's incredibly good timing. If he had done something like this 2 years ago, I honestly there would have been, I think, a lot of trouble, a lot of pushback. But in that sense, he reminds me of Putin in his ability to really strategize and prioritize what he has to do and when he has to do it, like to understand when he has the leverage.
I mean, honestly, I would say it's inevitable to the point where he becomes prime minister because Conte, he's good. He's pretty much in line with him on most issues. But at the end of the day, he's a background figure. He's someone who, will sign the bills and do like the paperwork. But at the end of the day, he doesn't have the charisma. He doesn't have the personality or the figure that you would need to do a move like this. So I imagine, you know, Conte is probably going to stay in there for a while, the current prime minister, but he's probably going to step down. And, look, Di Maio will probably at that point, the other deputy prime minister, say, look, you can have it, Salvini, because at this point, again, Salvini has become the Putin like figure of Italy. And honestly, maybe I'm exaggerating for a bit, but I see him having a good long time power. I see like like beyond like Merkel levels. I see like maybe even a couple decades. And you got to keep in mind he's in his 40s. That's young as far as politics go. So he can
Mm-hmm.
potentially stay in power a long time with the Italian system. There's no term limits on the prime minister, so as long as his party or coalition keeps on winning re-election, he can stay in power. Or even if they lose one election, he can be back in an election cycle or two. But I see him remaining in power, whether as main opposition leader, if not outright prime minister, for the next couple decades.
And he's so popular. I mean, the perception for a lot of North Americans is that he's actually the leader. That's just how charismatic he is.
I mean, that's how we talk about him.
Um,
Like we again, like I struggle to remember Conte's name for a second there.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, you're right. He's got a lot of mileage. Merkel's going to be out in 2 years, anyways. So that will be an end of an era. It'll be interesting to see where things go after that.
Yeah, Macron is on the rocks. I don't imagine the 2022 elections in France are really going to bode well, not even just his favor, but in favor of the establishment in general. I doubt Le Pen will outright win, but probably someone similar to her or someone more after her heart will win. Maybe they won't go as far as Italy, but they will start to go down that road in France.
Right, that's a strong possibility. Also, we should talk about, like, there are some political groups like the in Germany, like the AfD, that are supporting Salvini. So he's also energizing right wing populist movements in all of Europe. It's not just confined to Italy, and I think people are seeing this as a path forward.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because he's also been stumping for a lot of European Parliament candidates, not only in Italy but a lot of other countries too. So, and you could argue that I would argue that this started with Orban, but I think Orban is too explicitly close to Russia. I'm not saying Salvini isn't close to Russia, but I'm saying he doesn't publicize as much as someone like Orban would. But I would argue Salvini is the perfect figure because even though a lot of these European countries, as we were saying, might not view Russia as a threat, they still might have that apprehension about them. So if you have someone like Orban leading it, they're going to think, oh, what if he draws too close to Russia? But they have someone like Salvini leading it, they're still going to think, oh, we can still be Europe led by us Western European countries. So again, he's the perfect figure for this.
I agree. From a North American perspective, he is ideal in this regard, right? But from a European perspective, there's still a lot of Hungarians that are quite weary of Russia. Uh, Ironically, there's very few Italians that are weary of Russia. So two kind of opposite things are happening. The leader whose country is not afraid of Russia is carefully, tactfully, using good optics to not over associate with Russia. And Orban is doing a little bit of the opposite. However, I think, why is Orban doing that? I think we shouldn't forget that before Salvini, who else was there that could be an ally to Orban? So, A lot of it again is circumstantial in its timing.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised like if it's like a multifaceted thing where that him and the Hungarian and Italian governments actually cooperate, saying, "Look, we'll cater to this front, you cater to that front, and we'll work together towards this." It wouldn't surprise me if there's some level of to use an overused word, collusion going on there.
Hmm. Hmm. It's just good statesmanship.
Yeah, I mean that's how Europe has historically operated. It's been several states acting as a united front against or in favor of several other states, acting as a united front. And people, who live now, they've only known Europe either split between NATO and the Warsaw Pact or Europe as the EU. They've never seen like multi block Europe as they had before
Yeah.
World War One.
Right.
So the concept's still a bit foreign to them, but I mean, for people who even study the most basic history, you look back and it's like this was the norm throughout most of European history.
Yeah, and there's still a sizable amount of Europeans that are cognizant of that. And I don't mean just those that were alive during those times, but you can't teach, say, French history or Italian history or Polish history and whatnot, and not talk about these other eras that preceded the 20th century or mid 20th century onwards.
Yeah, and I do want to finish out the show with one last topic. That is actually we're getting a bit of progress on trade with China, so I'll put our little graphic up there, a little nice stock photo right there.
I like that one.
So let's find my notes again. So it is reported by one of Trump's top economic advisors that the U.S. may soon reach a deal with China. Now, the quote-unquote trade war actually began in March of last year and has happened intermittently. They've called it off and they've, brought it back on again. It's been one of those things that's been just periodic. Well, they'll come to like somewhat of a truce, but then they'll start tariffing and sanctioning each other again. So it's been an odd dynamic, but the U.S. and China actually came to a truce at the G20 back in November, which many, including myself, saw as groundwork for a final deal with China to end the quote-unquote trade war. Now, I've said several times before, if Trump has been successful in the Asia Pacific, and I'm happy with his progress there, but ultimately I want to see the U.S. assets leave China and go elsewhere. Unrealistic at the moment, I know, but again, I think we should gradually start moving towards that. And I'm not necessarily opposed to a deal with China, but I think it's wise, looking down the road, that we start to move assets out of China, especially as the relationship becomes more adversarial. Now, Trump has either violated or has been forced to back down on most of his campaign promises. The one area he's actually been able to live up to them, not only in Asia but just worldwide, is getting better trade negotiations. That's one thing you got to give to Trump. That and the economy, which, I mean, again, I don't think it's enough to win an election, but point being, he's still lived up to it. So if he can make a solid deal with China in these next few weeks, next few months, it may invigorate at least some of his base. I'm not saying it's going to be enough to carry 2020 or to, make the MAGA movement great again to, to add odd phrase to this, but it might invigorate some of his base. Maybe even some of his more working class base. They might actually feel the effects of a better trade deal. Since trade deals, you think of them on a geopolitical scale. We talk about them on a geopolitical scale, but at the end of the day, they're one of those few issues you can think about on the geopolitical scale, and also see how it directly affects the worker without having like too much time removed, as you think with a lot of these other things we talk about.
Right, and it's still a kind of a 5-to-1 trade deal ratio between China and America. But of course, China is manufacturing more than America is. That isn't to say that Trump's sanctions on China aren't effective. They've proven to be very effective, and it's that probably directly what led to the truce. China is basically asking, like, we'll make a deal, but you have to lift every sanction. I don't see Trump letting go of the sanctions anytime soon. Definitely not until there seems to be a complete restructuring of that trade deal. How that's going to happen, I'm not sure. Because, like I said before, yes, China does put tariffs on American goods that are coming in. I think China would be wise to not do that. because ultimately America is not going to export as much to China as the reverse. So, will China, I think, figure that out? I don't know. I think they will, it, but I'm not certain.
Now, one last thing I did want to say on this issue in particular, and probably for the show, is you have it. We were just talking about SWIFT. We were just talking about the financial system. I'm curious, even though it looks like the U.S. is coming from a position of strength in these trade talks, if the U.S. is trying to quickly make a deal before their sanctions and tariffs become meaningless because China and Russia have built an entirely alternative economic system.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that process is accelerating. I mean, in 2014 and 2015,
It was
there were
laughable.
rumblings of this, but like like 5 years later, it's a reality. It's like you can sense it.
Yeah, and you know what? At the end of the day, I'm completely satisfied with this. It brings a much needed balance of power back in this world because the unipolarism of either the British Empire or the United States just governing the entire world, it has not worked. You need multiple powers in the world for things to stay stable. Look, they might go head to head. We may have an almost nuclear war, but it's needed if you want some sort of global balance. Because look at the past. You could look at the post World War II era, or even to the post Cold War era. Things have not gone well.
Right. And also, I mean, one of the things that feeds um, the cultural war, of course, is American preeminence and American domination, global domination on so many fronts. I'll never forget last year when I was listening to John Mearsheimer talk that he gave, and he said, if you're tired of like where some of the elements of the left are going culturally speaking, then you're going to have to accept an America that's not an empire if you want to remedy that. And so that's now I've always wholeheartedly believed that long before I heard John Mearsheimer say it, because it's historically what happens. So yeah, on that front too, I would like to see, a reduction of this power, and we see it culturally too, with lots of liberals. I wouldn't say outright leftists, but liberals in America having strong feelings, positive feelings towards NATO, and they see America as like in the American military as something that is theirs, right? And they should be able to impose these massive cultural shifts that are always in tandem with economic agreements or wars.
Yeah, and not to drag on too much longer, but it actually reminds me, just looking at the reconstruction of the world post World War II, pretty much America, they, encouraged European and, to an extent Asian countries not to rebuild their militaries, especially their navies, because they wanted global dominance. And pretty much they said, look, you don't build them up, we'll give you money to rebuild your society. You're under our protection. You get our money. It's a win-win for you. But they turn over the entire world to American liberal dominance, and look how that's played out.
Right, 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 and especially in other countries where they're sick of it.
Yeah, and I know I said, this is my last point, but I was saying on Twitter a couple weeks back that, look, throughout the 2020s, I predict that we're going to see protests in populous countries in Europe. I predict we're going to see protests in, for example, such as Poland and to an extent maybe even Germany as the, groups like the ADF grow. They're going to start protesting American embassies and American military bases the same way Eastern Europeans protested against Soviet embassies and military bases in the 1980s.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. I mean, there was a protest in I forget which city it was in Germany in 2015, and it took place at night. It was torchlit, but not as ominous as people might think. And the Germans were literally chanting, "Merkel to Siberia, Putin to Berlin." Think about that.
Yeah, and then of course after
You
the
can, if you type that into YouTube, you can find the video.
yeah, and it's actually interesting enough because after the Syria strike last year, you had massive protests in Greece and a lot of other Eastern and Southern European countries. So we're seeing the murmurs of it, and especially if another major war breaks out within the next decade or so. You're going to see a massive backlash. against the U.S. presence in Europe. If not, I think in East Asia, such as Japan or South Korea. I know South Korea's had their protests. I think they're much more tolerant of it because of China. But I think in Europe, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union and the whole Russia aggression thing that didn't really pan out, I think you're going to see a lot of these protests be targeted at U.S. military, economic, and diplomatic influence.
Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely.
But I think that's really all I have to say for today. Pretty packed episode. No one major story, but a lot of small, significant stories. It's always good to have an episode like that. You can just jump from one topic to another like that. And I was worried this episode might actually be a little bit shorter today, but it's actually becoming one of the longer ones we've done. But thank you all for tuning in. I hope you all like the whole graphics thing. If you do, I'll keep
Thanks,
that up.
guys.
So see you guys next time, and goodbye.